This was all repeated again and again, until the slope was so covered with dead and wounded men that looking from our position, we could hardly see the ground. The cartridges were quickly brought to the line and distributed, just in time to meet the next attack. Hi, my name is Bill Coughlin, and host the First Person Civil War podcast. While the generals of both sides get most of the recognition, the Civil War was fought by the men in the ranks, and they told their stories during and after the war. Follow me as I reveal what these men witnessed in the battles of the Civil War. To celebrate the 50th episode of the podcast, I have decided to give you another special episode entitled Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota Face on 19 September, Corporal Carter and the 27th Mississippi, and on 20 September, Lieutenant Colonel Ray of the 60th North Carolina and Captain Bailey of the 58th North Carolina at the Battle of Chickamauga. This episode relies on 4 separate sources from the men who fought at Chickamauga. First, the story of a regiment, being a narrative of the service of the 2nd Regiment, Minnesota Veteran Volunteer Infantry in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Published by Lieutenant Colonel Judson W. Bishop in 1890. The next source is Walthal's Brigade, a cursory sketch with personal experiences of Walthal's Brigade, Army of Tennessee, CSA, 1862 to 1865, which Corporal Thomas C. Carter co-authored as a 3-man committee, and E.T. Sykes edited and published within Publications in the Mississippi Historical Society in 1916. Captain Isaac H. Bailey published the third source entitled Additional Sketch 58th Regiment. And finally, Lieutenant Colonel James M. Ray, who wrote 60th Regiment. Both North Carolina sources were published in 1901 within Histories of the Several Regiments and Battalions from North Carolina in the Great War, 1861 to 65, Volume 3. If you would like a map reference for the Battle of Chickamauga, I recommend battlefields.org. The maps available on their website are divided by time of day. For 19 September, look for the 10 a.m. through noon map, and for 20 September, the 11 a.m. through noon, as well as the 3 through 6 p.m. maps. Judson Wade Bishop was born on 24 June 1831 in Luray, New York, and grew up across the state. In the mid-1850s, he worked as a draftsman for a railroad company and eventually moved out to the Minnesota Territory in 1857, where he worked for a separate railroad and finally wrote and published a newspaper in Chatfield, Minnesota, from 1859 to the start of the war. Judson Bishop organized the Chatfield Guards in April 1861 and received a commission as a captain. He claims that due to a mishap in the mail, which was a letter that stated the false strength of his company, they were unable to form within the 1st Minnesota and instead became Company A of the 2nd Minnesota. The regiment saw its first action at the Battle of Mill Springs. Following the Battle of Perryville, Judson W. Bishop promoted to lieutenant colonel, and the regiment saw further service in the Tullahoma campaign. Thomas Clay Carter was born on 6 April 1845 in Perry County, Mississippi, but there is little information of his early life. On 10 August 1861, Thomas Carter enlisted as a corporal in Company B of the 27th Mississippi and saw service in the Siege of Pensacola, the Battle of Perryville, and Stones River. James Mitchell Ray was born on 15 November 1838 in Asheville, North Carolina, and according to census records, had by 1860 moved to Henry County, Tennessee, where he worked as a farmer with his family. James Ray wanted to fight in a North Carolina regiment and returned to Asheville, where on 16 May 1862 he enlisted in Company F of the 60th North Carolina. Though initially a first lieutenant, James Ray eventually promoted to captain and commanded Company F at the Battle of Stones River. Following the battle, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the 60th North Carolina. Isaac Hutzell Bailey was born on 3 March 1843 in Mitchell County, North Carolina, and by 17 May 1862 enlisted as a private in Company B of the 58th North Carolina, also known as the Partisan Rangers. The 58th North Carolina was sent to Tennessee, where it performed garrison duty in the state, and marched with General Bragg into Kentucky, but by the summer of 1863 had not fought in any battles. In the summer of 1863, Major General William Rosecrans had successfully marched his Army of the Cumberland out of Nashville with the intention of capturing the logistics hub of Chattanooga, Tennessee. His advance relied on maneuver more than set-piece battles against the Confederates. On 9 September, General Bragg and his Army of the Tennessee vacated Chattanooga and retreated into Georgia. With the city of Atlanta now under direct threat, Confederate reinforcements from across the South began converging on Georgia to properly meet this Union advance, which eventually included Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps from the Army of Northern Virginia. Now established in Chattanooga, Major General Rosecrans believed the Confederates to be demoralized and was unaware of this buildup of reinforcements. He sent his army into Georgia across a wide front which stretched his supply lines to their limits. As a division of the Union 14th Corps maneuvered around Davis's Crossroads, it encountered an aggressive Confederate force that attempted to flank and destroy it, but was unsuccessful. Major General Rosecrans, now aware of his precarious situation, recalled his army toward Chattanooga. Now with enough troops to go on the offensive, General Bragg wanted to isolate the 21st Corps around Chattanooga and eventually retake the city. By mid-September, both armies were concentrated in the northwest corner of Georgia, with the Union Army on the western bank of Chickamauga Creek and the Confederates on the eastern bank. On 18 September 1863, General Bragg sent troops toward Reed's Bridge and Alexander's Bridge to secure crossings for the army. Marching toward Alexander's Bridge was Corporal Carter and the 27th Mississippi, in Brigadier General Edward C. Walthall's brigade, of Brigadier General St. John R. Liddell's division, of Major General William H. T. Walker's Reserve Corps. As the All-Mississippi Brigade marched upon the bridge, they met a Union brigade of infantry. The Battle of Chickamauga had begun. By the end of the day, the Confederates had secured crossings over the creek, and Corporal Carter and the 27th Mississippi spent the night camped on the western bank. After Corporal Carter and his regiment marched further into position on the morning of the 19th, they witnessed the arrival of more reinforcements. Whilst resting there, some of the troops of Longstreet's corps marched past, and feeling their supposed superior keeping as members of the Army of Northern Virginia, were disposed good-naturedly to twist us, the Army of Tennessee, as not knowing what it was to fight and win battles, and they had come all the way from Virginia to show us. To the north of the Mississippians, not even a mile away, and along the Reed's Bridge Road, was Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota, who marched in Colonel Ferdinand Vanderveer's 3rd Brigade, in Brigadier General John Milton Brannan's 3rd Division, of Major General George Henry Thomas's 14th Corps. Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and his brigade, sent to find and engage an isolated brigade of Confederate infantry, instead found a brigade of cavalry. After proceeding along the road, which seemed to follow a ridge of small elevation, and while yet to the left and rear of Baird's division, of whose division we had no knowledge, we heard musketry to our right and front. Changing our direction to face it, to the southward, we moved off the ridge and down the easy slope, and soon met the enemy in force, now supposed to be Ector's and Wilson's brigades, and the firing began at once. In a few minutes, the enemy retired, then rallied and attacked again, and were again repulsed, this time retiring out of sight. As Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota held their ground against this cavalry, the Confederates made a call for reinforcements, and Walthal's brigade received orders to march to their aid. What Corporal Carter and the 27th Mississippi didn't know as they began their advance was that they would have to fight through 2 separate Union brigades before arriving at the Reed's Bridge Road. At or about 11 a.m., heavy firing was heard to our right, and Walthall was ordered to put his brigade in motion and advance in line of battle to support Ector's and Wilson's brigades, then engaged with the enemy, and being largely outnumbered, were sorely in need of reinforcements. Walthall's brigade, with Govan's brigade on the left, moved rapidly forward in line of battle, and soon encountered the enemy in strong force. This advance was made under a heavy artillery and musketry fire, but, pushing rapidly forward with a shout, it broke the first and then a second line of the enemy, and passing over 2 full batteries. These 2 lines were from Brigadier General Baird's division, just to the south of Vanderveer's brigade. Though unable to see through the trees and undergrowth, Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota did hear the advance of Walthal's Mississippians coming from the south. The firing approached, and the big guns joined in for a few rounds. Then a burst of cheers, the rebel yell. The artillery ceased, and the rattling of musketry came nearer, and the bullets thicker. Our men were getting nervous, and were ordered to lie down and hold their fire until they could see the enemy. Presently, to our astonishment, a straggling line of men in our own uniform appeared, then more of them, running directly toward us. Their speed accelerated every moment by the yelling and firing of the exultant enemy behind them. Our men got ready, and waited while the stampeded brigade, officers, and men passed over our lines to the rear. And then, as the pursuing enemy came in view, gave them a volley that extinguished their yelling and stopped their advance. They rallied, however, and stood for a few minutes, receiving and returning our fire, then wavered, broke, and ran out of sight. While a portion of the 34th Mississippi attempted to carry off the captured Union artillery, Corporal Carter, the 27th Mississippi, and the right of Walthal's brigade continued its advance directly toward Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota. But unfortunately for us, it resulted that after we had passed over the enemy's second line, reinforcements came up from his reserve, thereby enabling him to turn our brigade's right flank, and forcing us to withdraw and take position under orders from the division commander, to the right of the position where Major General Cheatham's division was preparing to advance. In the daring dash last referred to, and which continued for at least an hour, the brigade suffered heavily. As the Mississippians departed the field, Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota had to change front, as a brigade of cavalry advanced upon them from the north. After successfully repulsing them, their brigade was ordered to march toward the Kelly House, where it bivouacked for the night. For both armies, the second day of fighting did not go according to plan, as Major General Rosecrans and General Bragg fed fresh troops into the fighting on the northern and central parts of the battlefield, rather than maneuvering their forces according to their battle plans. On the night of 19 September, Major General Rosecrans convened a council of war and placed his army on a defensive footing. For General Bragg, who continued to receive fresh troops into the evening, stuck to his plan. He would assault the Union Army on the morning of 20 September. Held in reserve on the second day of fighting were both the 58th and 60th North Carolina regiments. Lieutenant Colonel Ray and the 60th North Carolina marched in Brigadier General Marcellus A. Stovall's brigade, in Major General John C. Breckinridge's division of Lieutenant General Daniel H. Hill's corps, and had by the morning of 20 September marched from the southern end of the battlefield to the northern end, and was arrayed against Major General Thomas's 14th Corps. Captain Bailey and the 58th North Carolina were assigned to Colonel John H. Kelly's 3rd Brigade, of Brigadier General William Preston's division, of Major General Simon Bolivar Buckner's corps, and on the morning of the 20th remained in the south facing the Union 20th Corps. Lieutenant Colonel Bishop, the 2nd Minnesota, and the rest of their brigade were assigned as the 14th Corps' reserve for the entire day. Designating a reserve is a common military practice in that a unit is intentionally placed behind a line of troops and could be used in an offensive manner, such as exploiting a breach in an enemy's line, or in the case of the 2nd Minnesota, plugging a hole in a defensive line. By 9 o'clock, the battle had resumed. Marching toward the northern end of the 14th Corps' line was Lieutenant Colonel Ray and the 60th North Carolina. The Federal line of battle was of an unheard-of shape, running east and west through Kelly's Field, then bending round due north and extending probably 500 yards, bending around again in a westward direction, some distance parallel to the line through Kelly's Field, but stopping short before reaching Lafayette Pike, or touching the line west of said pike, thus leaving an opening or gap in their line. What Lieutenant Colonel Ray just described was the northern end of the 14th Corps, with one division anchored on the Lafayette Road, and the next division in line arrayed in roughly a semicircle. It was where these two divisions met that Lieutenant Colonel Ray identified a gap in the line. And it was here the 60th got in its nice work. Passing the right of this west line, it forced its way into this gap, receiving an enfilading fire for a short time in passing said line, and drove the opposing forces back to Kelly's Field into their breastworks. Though the battle raged, Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota could do nothing but listen to the sounds of battle, see the wounded streaming back from the lines, and view artillery impacting in the field, until they were finally called to rush north. At this point, we passed through a thicket of small pines and other trees, which had obstructed our view to the north and east. Emerging from this, we crossed the road in line of battle, to take position on the left of a battery already there. Our brigade was in two lines, the 2nd Minnesota being on the right of the front line, nearest the battery, the 87th Indiana on its left, and the 35th and 9th Ohio in the second line. It was now about noon, and the Union 14th Corps was in crisis, as two Confederate brigades had successfully breached their line. But Lieutenant Colonel Ray's description of the semicircular line was only known to them after the battle, as the terrain was mostly wooded. According to Captain James T. Weaver, who wrote the official report of the 60th North Carolina, the Confederates then had to maneuver through the Union rear lines to exploit their success. We here captured a prisoner who stated that we were in the rear of their original line about 250 yards. Heavy firing being heard to the left, we were ordered to that point. We changed front by filing to the right, and facing by the rear rank were hurriedly marched in the direction of said fire. Having approached within 400 yards of the enemy's line, we received a heavy fire from the front, and from there advanced through a brisk fire to within 200 yards of the enemy's line, where we were halted and returned the enemy's fire. The infantry that appeared in front of Lieutenant Colonel Ray and the 60th North Carolina was Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota. As we halted on the east side of the road and began looking for the enemy whose appearance we expected in our front, the air was suddenly filled with bullets, and a line of gray smoke appeared along the edge of the woods on our left at right angles with our lines. A change of front to the left was instantly ordered and executed by the left wheel of the brigade. Pending this movement, which was made on the run, we could not return the enemy's fire, and we lost a good many men. The wheel completed, our line commenced firing at once, but finding ourselves at disadvantage in the open field, we charged up to the edge of the woods, driving the enemy back, and then again opened fire on them at short range. They were stubborn and slow to give way, and after a few minutes firing by our front line, Colonel Vanderveer ordered the second line to pass the first and charge them. This was done, the first line joining the charge, and the enemy's front was thus broken up, and soon they retired, leaving the field and their wounded in our possession. The 2 brigades of Breckinridge's division, though poised to flank the 14th Corps, could not exploit their success, and Lieutenant Colonel Ray notes the toll that both sides paid in the clash. The casualties in the last hour of the charge were heavy. Lieutenant Colonel Ray was severely wounded and forced to leave the field, after calling acting Lieutenant Colonel Weaver, notifying him of his being disabled, and turning over to him command of the regiment. The regiment in this last action here was confronted by the 2nd Minnesota, which reported a loss of 33% of its members, fighting 2 behind breastworks. Just as a side note to this metric, Lieutenant Colonel Bishop reported that of a regiment of 384 men, 162 were killed, wounded, or missing, a 42% casualty rate. The metric of 33% casualties on 20 September was indeed true, as reported by Colonel James George, the 2nd Minnesota's commander. But this included still more fighting for the 2nd Minnesota. Though the 14th Corps' left flank was saved by the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Bishop, the 2nd Minnesota, and their entire brigade, a catastrophe to the south was about to unfold. Throughout the battle, Major General Rosecrans shifted divisions from one part of the battlefield to another, and in the late morning, he ordered Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood's division to shift to the north to close what he perceived as a hole in his line, but in reality was not there. Brigadier General Wood reluctantly obeyed the order and began moving his troops, and in doing so created an actual hole in the Union line. It was into this hole in the line that a Confederate assault column from Lieutenant General Longstreet's corps of approximately 10,000 men advanced and successfully split the Army of the Cumberland in 2. At the point of the breach and to the south, the Union 20th and part of the 21st Corps were routed and departed the field. The Confederates turned to the north to smash the 14th Corps and what remained of the 21st Corps. While the 14th Corps' semicircle remained intact, Major General Thomas directed the formation of a new Union line in vicinity of the Snodgrass House and Horseshoe Ridge. One of the regiments sent to hold this new line was Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota. As we got into the open field, where we had been in reserve in the morning, we were met by an aide from General Thomas, who conducted us to Horseshoe Ridge, so called near the Snodgrass House. The battle seemed to be trending to that position from all directions, and we could see that we were needed there. General Thomas rode down to meet us, and after giving some directions to Colonel Vanderveer, sat upon his horse and looked the men over as we marched past him and up the slope of the ridge. One of the regiments that initially formed upon Horseshoe Ridge and met the Confederates in the assault column was Major Arnold McMahon of the 21st Ohio. At 12 o'clock, our regiment was assigned a position upon a curved ridge, our front being south. A deep ravine was in front of this ridge, and on our right, heavy timber. On our left, an open field with timber beyond. Immediately after taking position, the enemy skirmishers engaged us, and in a short time, a strong force moved against us. A severe engagement resulted in the repulse of the enemy. This demonstration of the enemy for the occupation of this important position was made before the arrival of the support heretofore stated. And though superior in numbers, he was unable to endure the repeated volleys of our superior arms, which were Colt revolving rifles. The new line upon Horseshoe Ridge was critical to the Union Army, in that it prevented the Confederates from enveloping what remained of the Army of the Cumberland. Eventually, Lieutenant Colonel Bishop, the 2nd Minnesota, and the rest of Colonel Vanderveer's brigade arrived and took their place in line. Arriving on the ridge, our regiment took the place of one already there, the 21st Ohio, which had exhausted its cartridge boxes, and immediately had a view of the assaulting columns of the enemy, just commencing the ascent of the southern slope in our front. Ranks followed ranks, in close order, moving briskly and bravely toward us. It was theirs to advance, ours now to stand and repel. Again, the order was passed to aim carefully and to make every shot count, and the deadly work began. The front ranks melted away under the rapid fire of our men, but those following bowed their heads to the storm of bullets and pressed on, some of them falling at every step until, the supporting touch of elbows being lost, the survivors hesitate, halt, then turning, start back with a rush that carries everything with them to the rear. All who escape the bullets as deadly in the wild retreat as in the desperate and orderly advance. With only half of an army to face, every available Confederate regiment began to concentrate upon Horseshoe Ridge to replace the spent assaulting regiments. After marching from the southern end of the battlefield, Captain Bailey and the 58th North Carolina finally arrived in vicinity of Horseshoe Ridge. They deployed on the right flank of their brigade, which included the 63rd Virginia and the 5th Kentucky, and advanced toward Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota. The approach of these ridges was along spurs, and where ridges intersected ridges, and through intervening depressions or hollows, all more or less wooded, but more open and exposed on the right of the brigade. One of the assaults had been made by General Anderson's brigade. Before we could reach him in such a way as to successfully relieve, he had been repulsed. Upon the ridge, Lieutenant Colonel Bishop and the 2nd Minnesota continued to hold their ground after repeated assaults. As the afternoon waned into the evening, the Union line received its last reinforcements from the Reserve Corps, as well as ammunition. This was all repeated again and again, until the slope was so covered with dead and wounded men that looking from our position, we could hardly see the ground. The cartridges were quickly brought to the line and distributed, just in time to meet the next attack. Advancing up the ridge, directly in front of the 2nd Minnesota, was Captain Bailey in the 58th North Carolina. The line being formed again, the 58th North Carolina, which was on the right, moved with steadiness through the comparatively open space till the extreme right arrived within 10 or 12 feet of the enemy. After exchanging fire with the enemy for about 1 3/4 of an hour, we attempted to dislodge him by assault, and for this purpose, the 58th North Carolina was transferred from the right to the left of the line, away from the 2nd Minnesota, and moved forward, somewhat swinging to the right. When we arrived at the base of the hill, the enemy was heard to cry, "We surrender! We surrender!" The attack of the 58th North Carolina upon the 2nd Minnesota was noted by Lieutenant Colonel Bishop, and he agrees with Captain Bailey on just how close his regiment got to the Union line. This was made by fresh troops, and their advance was only broken up when their foremost men were within 10 paces of our line. Some of them came on and surrendered. Most of them who ran back were killed or wounded before they got out of range. Another attack was made just before dark, and was repulsed in our front as the others had been. But there seemed to be no contest on the right, where Steedman's line had been, and presently we found that his troops had been withdrawn, and that the enemy were groping their way around to our right and rear, and had already captured a few detachments which had been with us and Steedman. As night descended, what remained of the Union Army retreated from Chickamauga, leaving the Confederates the victors of the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and in some regiments the toll was severe. The 58th North Carolina, having only seen fighting on Horseshoe Ridge, suffered 50% casualties according to their brigade commander's report, of which Captain Bailey was counted among the wounded. On the 60th North Carolina's report, the regiment suffered a total of 60 killed, wounded, and missing, but Lieutenant Colonel Ray rejects this number. The hurried and brief reports of commanding officers make it absolutely impossible to give the casualties of the 60th in these different engagements. But they were great, some of the companies having only 5 or 6 men to answer to their names at roll call on the night of the 20th. Corporal Carter of the 27th Mississippi, though he did not identify exactly which regiment or brigade, claims to have seen the same unit from Longstreet's corps after the battle. After the Battle of Chickamauga had been fought, those same troopers were free to admit their mistaken estimate of the fighting qualities of the soldiers of the Army of Tennessee, and equally free to concede that the Federal troops from the West, under Rosecrans, were more stubborn fighters than were the Eastern troops, with whom the Army of Northern Virginia had been till then fighting. Thank you for listening to the 50th episode of First Person Civil War Podcast. For over 1.5 years, I have had the privilege of finding the stories of the men who fought in the ranks and brought them to you. And I hope you have gained a greater understanding on how important regimental histories and personal memoirs are to better understanding what happened on the battlefield. I am committed to continuing this podcast to share more stories with you. Links to Lieutenant Colonel Bishop's, Corporal Carter's, Lieutenant Colonel Ray's, and Captain Bailey's books are now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting the podcast financially. Follow the Support Podcast link at the top left of the homepage. Payments secured by the Clover Network. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find pictures of all 4 men. While each of my episodes are perfect companions for a battlefield trip, I have wanted to do even more to bring the soldier's voice back to the battlefield. On the podcast YouTube page, under the Shorts tab, you will find regular updates of battlefield reports that correspond with a unit monument, such as the 69th Pennsylvania at Gettysburg, and Brigadier General Thomas Stonewall Jackson at First Bull Run. For this next episode, I want to introduce a new concept to the podcast that will not only focus on soldiers' accounts on the battlefield and battlefield reports, but also highlight terrain and just how many regiments and brigades fought for a particular piece of land. To do this, and to match with the anniversary of the battle, the next episode will publish on 17 September. On 17 September, to mark the 163rd anniversary, I've decided to make another special episode using personal accounts and official reports. Major Rufus R. Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin. Lieutenant Colonel Philip A. Work of the 1st Texas. Captain John B. Callis of the 7th Wisconsin. Brigadier General Marcina R. Patrick's 3rd Brigade. Colonel Hamilton A. Braun of the 1st North Carolina. Colonel Alfred H. Colquitt of Raines's Brigade. And Colonel Silas Colgrove of the 27th Indiana. All vie for possession in a series of charges and counterattacks in the early morning hours of 17 September in the cornfield at the Battle of Antietam. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.